Hello. Uh, the lecture that I'm going to deliver is about rape. And I'll give a trigger warning. I'm going to discuss rape and sexual violence in detail. And I'm going to try to contextualize rape, making reference to class, class structure, class antagonism, and the relationship between structural violence and sexual violence. I'm also going to discuss the importance of rape and sexual violence and gender-based violence as an electoral issue. So that is all. I hope that you enjoy the lecture and I hope that you're doing well. Thank you. So I'll begin by discussing social class and rape. Social class is a Marxist concept that is used to refer to the relationship between one's social positioning in society and class antagonism. And for Marx, the ruling ideology of our time and every time is the ideology of the ruling class. And so the ideology of gender and our understanding of rape and sexual violence is perhaps framed by the ruling class. And what this unfortunately means is that working class women and poor women are often at a greater risk of being victims of sexual violence, gender-based violence, sexual harassment, rape, child sexual abuse, and other forms of gender-based violence. So the concept of class as a way of conceptualizing inequality continues to divide sociologists. While all agree that most societies experience some form of stratification and hence inequality, they are divided about the form and nature of that inequality. So sociologists often agree that societies are stratified in different ways, but depending on the kind of research that one does or has done, the nature of this inequality and therefore the ways to address this inequality are often debated in the field of sociology. So urban sociologists often discuss housing in great detail and would argue that stratification is expressed in really extreme ways in terms of who can access housing, who is homeless, and who is a property owner. Sociologists who have studied conflict theories, as I have, like neo-Marxist theories, which I studied as a PhD student in critical race theory and gender studies and feminist theory, would argue that stratification and inequality is expressed at the level of social relations, and that even if there is equality in terms of housing or jobs, gender-based violence, domestic violence, extrajudicial police killings of police murders of Black people in the Americas and in the UK will always express really vulgar forms of inequality that destroy the lives of the most marginalized working class and poor people. So I would argue that identity politics often expresses really obscene forms of inequality, such as the murder of Indigenous women and girls. And money itself, I would argue, cannot really address the kind of trauma of this inequality. So by social class, we mean, quote, a position within a system of structured inequality based on the equal distribution of power, wealth, income, and status. Social class position impacts upon life chances, which are the opportunities available to people throughout their lives. These include everything from the chance to stay alive during the first year after birth, to the chance to view fine arts, the chance to remain healthy and grow tall, and if sick, to get well again quickly, the chance to avoid becoming a juvenile delinquent, and very crucially, the chance to complete an intermediary or higher educational grade. So there have been a lot of really interesting research studies about social class and gender. And one of the books that I cited in previous lectures and publications is this text, which was published many years ago in 2001, but I think is still a really interesting text called Growing Up Girl, Psychosocial Explorations of Gender and Class. And it was written by Valerie Walkerdine, Helen Lucy, and June Melody. Set against a backdrop of deindustrialization, rising male unemployment, and the feminization and casualization of the labor market, Growing Up Girl graphically explores the complexities of gender and class during a period of massive social change. It tells the story of today's I Can Have Everything girls who face unprecedented shifts in the organization of family, education, and work, and yet who continue to struggle with the not always visible, but always palpable pressures of wealth, poverty, class, and ethnicity. So the book is interesting because it touches on intersections of gender, race, and class, which I've discussed in previous lectures, but through the lens of class as being the foremost, the most important identity that structures these people's lives, whom the authors follow throughout the life course. So I previously held a position of visiting fellow at Birkbeck College, and I worked as part of a project called Here is Single. And Here is Single looks at the lives of single or I guess unmarried women in Shanghai and New Delhi, India, Shanghai, China, New Delhi, India, throughout the course of their lives. And this research project is similar because the authors, Walkerdine, Lucy, and Melody, follow girls throughout the course of their lives to look at the relationship between class, ethnicity, gender, and life choices and happiness. Drawing on data spanning nearly 20 years, the authors of this groundbreaking study provide a sobering antidote to commonplace platitudes about girl power and a feminine future. They reveal the hidden price of middle-class girls' apparently effortless achievements, obsessive hard work, guilt, and devastating feelings of inadequacy, and they trace how the labor market cruelly sets material limits on the disappointed hopes and ambitions of working class girls, vividly illustrating their arguments with quotations from the research participants. They show how young women's practices of self-invention are regulated both by unconscious processes and real social and economic constraints. Their insistent conclusion is that class is far from dead. Indeed, it is centrally important to our understanding of what it is to be a young woman today in today's complex and challenging world. This important and gripping book is essential reading for scholars in sociology and cultural studies. So this research regarding social class, I think, is extremely important in thinking about sexual violence. And a lot of the research that has been done about sexual violence and rape in the global north has often looked at gender and gender roles, power relations, but I would argue that social class is central to sexual violence, rape, and to how people make sense of rape and sexual violence, to one's agency to report rape, and to how the criminal justice system understands survivors and perpetrators. When we think about poverty, we tend to think within the parameters of the common poverty indicators, such as low income, socioeconomic status, or indices of absolute or relative poverty. But these indicators in themselves are not accurate or concrete measures of poverty. Rather, they're proxies, statistically amenable ways of operationalizing some of the more measurable aspects of poverty. Poverty itself is a much more complex phenomenon than these proxy measures sometimes indicate. Poverty encompasses a multitude of deprivations that are related but not restricted to low income or income inequality. These other aspects of deprivation include things such as home ownership, standard housing, access to government services such as health and education, and standard of local infrastructure such as roads, sanitation, and water supplies. In addition, aspects of living that are not easily named or measured, such as quality of life, social cohesion, family and social networks, autonomy and opportunity for future prosperity, are also important in assessing levels of poverty. So, of all Canadian women who live in poverty today, female lone parents are especially vulnerable. 51.6% of lone parent families headed by women are poor. There is also an overrepresentation of women who are seniors, women with disabilities, Aboriginal women, and also immigrant women. These women also face additional barriers. They are often subject to gender discrimination and racism. In the case of women with disabilities, to a lack of respect and understanding of their abilities. Sorry, you might hear me drinking water. It's a lot of words to read. Poverty is among the root causes of sexual violence and often has a daily presence in a victim's life. Sexual violence also can jeopardize a person's economic well-being, often leading to homelessness, unemployment, interrupted education and health, mental health, and other stressors and struggles. So, the relationship between sexual violence and poverty is ongoing and cyclical, that one is often more vulnerable to sexual violence and rape because of poverty. And then one's response to sexual violence is determined often by poverty. So I would argue that rape culture has been really central to mainstream politics in the last 10 years, that rape culture has appeared in mainstream electoral politics in really terrifying ways. Rishi Sunak has discussed the rights of women and rape throughout his term as Prime Minister of the UK. And it's interesting to think of how rape and sexual violence is now an electoral issue and why. Without his in-house epiphanies, Sunak might never have understood as a father to daughters the need for girls to feel safe walking around in the evening or to be educated to the same extent as boys, which is disturbing, but still better late. His daughters are credited too in Sunak's tribute to the lioness's victories, and with quote, women's rights are personal to me, his appreciating the need for single-sex spaces. So Sunak then has argued that jokes about rape are not punishable by being fired. And these jokes about rape have reached British Parliament, with members of Parliament making jokes about rape drugs. So these jokes about the drug Rufinol, which is a drug that has been associated with facilitating sexual assault, was seen to be funny or was made a joke of in British Parliament, but these jokes are not punishable by firing anyone. So the charity Rape Crisis has reported 1 in 4 women being raped or sexually assaulted as an adult, and the highest number of rape cases reported to the police in the UK in March 2020 was 70,330. The overall statistics in England and Wales found that 85,000 women experienced rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault every year. So again, the class structure, I think, is important here, that someone can market themselves as, yes, the father of daughters in ways that correspond to a conservative family model, but their fellow middle class and rich men can make jokes about rape without being fired. And so these statistics from the UK are about sexual violence against children. In its latest assessment of the scale of child sexual abuse offending, the National Crime Agency estimated that between 550,000 and 850,000 individuals in the UK post varying degrees of sexual risk to children online or offline, with this figure skewed towards online offending. Donald Trump, former president of the United States of America, was also known to make rape jokes throughout his term as president of the United States of America. And again, I want to question why sexual violence and rape and making comments about rape and rape jokes has become part of mainstream party politics. This kind of use of really sexist language, especially jokes, I think, is a way that rich men and middle-class men try to attract working-class people to vote for them and try to normalize high levels of sexual violence and domestic violence and child abuse throughout the countries or throughout the countries they represent.
Go to another life, maybe heaven, maybe purgatory, maybe hell. These are the
true stars that they can grab women by the.
Well, that's what it's, if you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true, not always, but largely true. Unfortunately or fortunately.
You consider yourself to be a star?
I think you can say that.
She's accusing me of rape. A woman that I have no idea who she is. It came out of the blue. She's accusing me of rape, of raping her. The worst thing you can do, the worst charge. And you know it's not true too. You're a political operative also. You're a disgrace. but she's accusing me, and so are you, of rape, and it never took place. And I will tell you, I made that statement and I said, well, it's politically incorrect. She's not my type. And that's 100% true. She's not my type.
This ridiculous situation that we're doing right now. It's a big fat hoax. She's a liar and she's a sick person, in my opinion, really sick. Something wrong with her.
So the politics of celebrity have become really inextricable from electoral politics and from the politics of rape. So this article is written by Stephanie Stark and Sophia Collignon, and it is about the relationship between American electoral politics and sexual harassment and assault. And in the article, the authors discuss the ways that the media often frames these instances of rape and sexual assault to be newsworthy events, but also to further the celebrity of men who are accused of sexual assault. So I will move on to discuss space and race and violence. Shireen Razak discusses the ways that settler colonialism spatializes sexual violence against Indigenous women and girls and normalizes the use of working class spaces as spaces where middle class men can travel to enact violence against Indigenous women and girls. And Razak has written about the case of Pamela George, and Pamela George was a woman who was killed, she was an Indigenous woman who was killed and arguably killed by a group of white settler men. And what Razak tries to demonstrate are the ways that white settler men can exist in different spaces and use different spaces of Canada to live very different lives and to treat different groups of women as their beloved white wives in suburban homes or as Indigenous women who live in working class areas and poor areas who can be raped and killed. And this kind of spatialization is something Razak describes as fundamental or as crucial to settler identity, that Canadian settlers can have these very middle-class, pristine lives, suburban homes and wives and country clubs, and then they can go into Indigenous territories to rape and kill Indigenous women and girls. And Razak writes, in examining the transcripts of the case, one can hardly miss the spatiality of the violence and its relationship to identity as well as to justice. The men leave the university and their families and girlfriends in middle-class homes in the suburbs to spend time with each other in places that are outside civilized society, from drinking under bridges beside airports and beside the hockey arenas. They proceed to the stroll, the streets of prostitution occupied by racial others, and ultimately to the murder scene. In the elite spaces of middle-class life, the university, suburban homes, chalets, and cottages, they learn who they are, and more importantly, who they are not. So Razak discusses settler colonial violence, and specifically white cishet male settler colonial violence against Indigenous women and girls as a move from respectable to degenerate space and back again. So moving from respectable to degenerate space and back again is an adventure that serves to confirm that they are indeed white men in control, who can survive a dangerous encounter with the racial other, and who have an unquestioned right to go anywhere and do anything. These journeys of transgression are deeply historical ones. White settlers displaced Pamela George's ancestors, confining her Saulteaux Nation and and others to reserves. Pamela George's own geographies begin here. Colonization has continued apace. Forced to migrate to the cities in search of work and housing, urban Aboriginal peoples in cities like Regina quickly find themselves limited to places like the Stroll. Over-policed and incarcerated at one of the highest rates in the world, their encounters with white settlers have principally remained encounters in prostitution, policing, and the criminal justice system. So Razak argues that part of decolonization in the humanities and part of producing scholarship from an anti-colonial perspective is to unmap these journeys. That is to say, Razak wants to denaturalize the spaces and bodies described in the trial in an effort to uncover the hierarchies that are protected and the violence that is hidden when we believe such spatial relations and subjects to be naturally occurring. To unmap, one must historicize, a process that begins by asking about the relationship between identity and space. What is being imagined or projected onto specific spaces, and I would add bodies. And so Catherine McKittrick is a really impressive and well-cited Black Canadian feminist scholar who discusses the ways that race is made in space and space is made because of race, that one becomes racialized through certain spaces and spaces are formed through processes of racialization that often support certain racial hierarchies. So gentrification is a great example. How do you know that in a gentrified neighborhood, you are part of the so-called creative class as opposed to the local working class? And I would argue that race and class are central to who sees themselves as being entitled to certain spaces and things within a neighborhood. So what is really disturbing in the case of Indigenous peoples and settler colonial violence and Canadian racism is that sexual violence against Indigenous women is central to the politics of race and class and to the politics of making certain spaces middle class as opposed to working class or poor. Sexual violence towards Aboriginal women was an integral part of 19th century settler technologies of domination. In her research on the appearance during this time of captivity narratives, stories about the abduction of white women and children by Aboriginal peoples, Sarah Carter documents the important role that stereotypical representations of Aboriginal women played in maintaining the spatial and symbolic boundaries between settlers and natives. Finally, I'll finish by discussing rape and the politics of rape. The first book I wrote was written after a historic gang rape and murder of a young woman on a bus in New Delhi, India, Jyoti Singh. And I conducted interviews in New Delhi and throughout India about the politics of rape, sexual freedom, sex, and power.
I feel like
So this is a clip about rape culture and the university system.
always behaviour for me started at school.
I feel like the most common one is nudes. Like, I feel like everyone has been asked.
You either know someone who has had an experience or you are someone that has had an experience. I'm going to share a story about a sexual assault that happened to me that I've never spoken about before. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was still light out. The guy followed me from the high street and he was getting closer and closer to me. And that's when I started to feel a little bit scared. I could feel him coming up behind me. And then he just said,
I think as a woman, like, you're always just wary at night and you always want to, like, you know, be as safe as you possibly can.
anytime I'm out on my own, like, and there's like I see a group of men, they could be like over there, and I'm still gonna pretend I'm on the phone, or like I will be on the phone, or like I look down. I just don't want to make eye contact with people. Like, it is scary.
I feel like boys' behaviour for me started at school for sure.
Oh, 100%.
We all left school 6 or 7 years ago. I wonder what it's like for girls in school today.
So the definition of sexual assault is really interesting if we think about it in relation to rape and what broad definitions can do in legal cases. So Canada has a broad definition of sexual assault. It includes all unwanted sexual activities such as unwanted sexual grabbing, kissing, and fondling, as well as rape. So the problem is that if this definition is really broad, then does it equate something like unwanted touching with rape? Rape, from my research in India, can be equated with extreme bodily violence. Rape can be so forceful that it can kill a person. It can also severely damage someone's body and the possibility of transmitting sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV and AIDS, is obviously quite high in cases of rape. Sexual activity is only legal, says the Canadian law, when both parties consent. Consent is defined in Canada's Criminal Code in Section 27311 as the voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity in question. The law focuses on what the person was actually thinking and feeling at the time of sexual activity. Sexual touching is only lawful if the person affirmatively communicated their consent, whether through words or conduct. Silence or passivity does not equal consent. Rape is a type of sexual assault involving sexual intercourse or other forms of sexual penetration carried out against a person without their consent. So what I would argue is that there is a real class dimension to the distinction that is often made between rape and sex. So in the 1980s and 90s, there were many prominent feminists who argued that rape must be thought of not in relation to sex, but in relation to power. And this, I think, was particularly true, but it was a response to really strong writings by feminists like Andrea Dworkin, who made the case that in many instances, sex is rape or sex. Andrea Dworkin wrote a lot of controversial essays about the relationship between sexism, sex, pornography, and rape. And Dworkin sometimes argued in her writings that there is always an element of coercion, or in many cases, there is an element of coercion or a power imbalance in relationships of sex. And so other feminists, more mainstream feminists whose writing often made mainstream American media, argued that power or argued that rape is an act of power and that rape should never be equated with sex. And I think that it is important in this time period to return to the writings of Andrea Dworkin, who was also really critical of the ways that class shapes one's agency in sexual relationships and sexual or romantic relationships. So in the book that I wrote about India, obviously I discussed class and caste in detail. In Indian law, it is not against the law for a husband to rape his wife. And the law is quite clear that a husband, a man, can rape his wife. And the politics of poverty obviously shape a woman's capacity to say no to marriage and to rape. India has one of the highest rates of female illiteracy and poverty and unemployment in the world. So obviously, consent is shaped by the politics of class, that it might be impossible for a woman or girl to eat if she does not marry and she does not consent to heterosexual sex. And India has ruled against gay and lesbian and transgender marriage. So rape is actually central to how entire societies are organized. The term rape originates from the Latin rapere, supine stem raptum, to snatch, to grab, to carry off. In Roman law, the carrying off of a woman by force with or without intercourse constituted raptus. It's interesting to think about the actual term and the etymology of the term, to snatch, to grab, to carry off, rather than being about sex and actual bodily violence. Rape was actually thought of as a form of kidnapping, as a taking of a person. And I think rape was central in this kind of classic definition, which shaped medieval law, to forced marriages. In medieval English law, the same term could refer to either kidnapping or rape in the modern sense of sexual violation. It's interesting to think of how we often associate rape with stranger rape. And there is a specific class dynamic in the history of rape. Emmett Till, the case of Emmett Till, is often a really widely cited case in Black history and in intersectional approaches to feminism. And Emmett Till was a young Black man who was falsely accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. And it was only after Emmett Till was lynched to death by those who opposed the abolition of slavery that the woman who accused him came forward or told the truth and said that she lied and that Emmett Till had not sexually assaulted her. So this construction of stranger rape is really, I think, about the politics of class and slavery, that historically rape was actually equated with forced marriage. It was not equated with strangers or with nightlife or with alcohol. So women are obviously 5 times more likely to be raped than men. Rates of sexual assault were higher among 15 to 24-year-olds. And it's interesting to think about whether or not high statistics of rape among certain populations actually correspond to high rates of reporting. So the rise in statistics of rape in India, for example, in my research, actually corresponds to the rise in young women's education, employment, and therefore agency to report rape. So while it might seem as though rape is getting worse, someone's agency to report rape is actually increasing. So sexual violence can lead directly to HIV risk in a variety of ways. Condoms are not often used in sexual assault, and the physical trauma of rape can make the risk for HIV transmission higher than it is during consensual sex. Besides rape and sexual assault, sexual violence can include control over sexual health decisions. There are situations when sex is consensual, but one partner coerces the other partner into not using condoms or other prevention methods. This coercion has direct implications for sexual health. So the relationship between rape, pregnancy, and poverty is really terrifying in this time period due to the banning of abortion throughout the United States of America. So I will play a clip about the relationship between abortion laws and rape in America. And the laws have been changing quite quickly since the Dobbs ruling, which limited access to abortion throughout many states in the United States of America. So this is a clip of current President Joe Biden discussing rape and abortion in America.
Victory. I'll tell you about victory. Victory is a feeling. The feeling you get when you get to speed by in the bus lane.
The threat of criminal penalties for doctors and healthcare providers. Just last week, it was reported that a 10-year-old girl was a rape victim in Ohio, 10 years old. And she was forced to have to travel out of the state to Indiana to seek to terminate the presidency and maybe save her life. That's last part is my judgment. 10 years old. 10 years old. Raped, 6 weeks pregnant, already traumatized, was forced to travel to another state. Imagine being that little girl. I'm serious. Just imagine being that little girl, 10 years old.
So obviously, the laws are being debated, and the relationship between rape and abortion is actively debated on an everyday basis throughout America. There are more and more cases of specifically young girls and young Black girls who have been raped and now cannot access abortion, and who are often not in a financial position to travel to New York to have an abortion, or to Canada to have an abortion, and whose entire family is not in a position to support them. The relationship between rape and slavery is a really disturbing example of human cruelty. And Saadia Hartman is a well-respected scholar whose work I've cited in previous lectures. And Hartman discusses the ways that rape was central to slavery and to the hatred of Black women historically in America. In 19th century common law, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. Yet the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was an offense neither recognized nor legislated by law. Rape was not simply unimaginable because of purported Black lasciviousness, but its repression was essential to the displacement of white culpability that characterized both the recognition of Black humanity in slave law and the designation of the Black subject as the originary locus of transgression and offense. The cases of State of Missouri versus Celia and George versus State averred that the enslaved in general and captive women in particular were not appropriate subjects of common law and thus not protected against rape. This kind of permissibility of the rape of Black women, I think, is central to the ways that white colonizing men had access to every group of women's bodies. Indigenous women who were colonized, slave women, and had access to their own wives. And this is also true in the history of the East India Tea Company, where British men could not, or were obviously often not jailed for sexual violence against colonized women in India who were taken as concubines forcibly. But marriage was also a way of masking sexual violence as well, so that men who were in the most privileged positions could rape all girls and women. So this relationship between constructing Black women as private property and rape is the ultimate form of class antagonism, that when someone could be made to be property, they could be violated in every possible way and then disposed of through murder. So Andrea Dworkin then discusses the gendered doxa of rape. And Dworkin's work elicited a lot of reactions. The extreme nature of reactions to Dworkin indicates the importance of normative or ideological context for the evaluation of autobiographical texts. And Dworkin essentially said that to be a woman meant to be someone who was a potential victim of rape, because of this gendered construction of rape. And Dworkin saw rape as being a gendered crime that men are often encouraged to commit against women. This context is broadly framed by the set of shared norms or belief that Roland Barthes referred to as doxa. These beliefs structured our understanding of everyday happenings and our judgment of the reliability, both factual and normative, of autobiographical and other factual texts. Applied to rape, these beliefs include both common sense understandings of how and under what circumstances rape occurs, and gendered beliefs about how women and men should and do behave. Hegemonic beliefs in this area are often referred to by feminists as rape myths, because they often bear little direct relation to the realities of rape. For instance, there is a strong cultural belief that rapes are generally committed by violent strangers, whereas in reality, most sexual assaults occur between partners, acquaintances, and family members. These myths create an alternative reality which fractures and distorts women's experiences and narratives. So when women do have any kind of middle class privilege, then this middle class privilege is used to discount the possibility that women, and specifically women of color, experience any oppression. But when women of color are poor, then their poverty is used to discount culpability of those who are accused of rape and also other crimes like discrimination. So either way, white men are never held accountable, because if you're middle class, you obviously are so privileged you couldn't be a victim of anything. And if you're working class, you obviously are then somehow pathologized. And this happens over and over again in Canada, which has a culture of really smug white male arrogance. So Canada has comprehensive laws against sexual violence. However, I would argue that because of the history and ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples and violence against Indigenous women and girls, these laws are often not applied equally to all. So finally, I'll discuss the relationship between heterosexism and the sexualization of rape. Michel Foucault discusses the ways that power often produces certain effects. Foucault's notion that power produces effects in the body proves useful in evaluating feminist responses to rape, because it aids in the articulation of a politics of agency. Foucault's notion of power as a productive force provides insight into how the sexed body in particular is the primary target of techniques of disciplinary power. But Foucault's theory also suggests that the very targets of disciplinary power are also the point at which these techniques are resisted and thwarted. Indeed, Foucault's work offers a vehicle through which to critique feminist responses to rape, while simultaneously providing a mechanism through which to build a politics of rape prevention. Employing a Foucauldian analysis of the body requires a careful examination of the power relations that are inscribed on the feminine body. A significant part of the female victim's experience of rape is the constitutive element. That is, rape is an instance in which discourses of power produce the feminine body as viable and weak. Foucault tells us, however, that resistance to this constitutive discourse of power is also located within the feminine body. So Michel Foucault suggests that the physical violence of rape should be penalized, while Foucault's call for the desexualization of rape allows for a repositioning of female subjectivity. It does so in a particular way, at the expense of women's lived experience of rape. In Foucault's equation, raped bodies are rendered utterly independent from the social context in which rape occurs. So Foucault's interest in thinking only about rape as a forcing of someone to have sex removes social context such as social class from the narrative of rape. Foucault asserts that to suggest that power is fundamentally repressive in the juridical discursive sense is to oversimplify its situational, productive, and relational capacities. Michel Foucault argues that power is not something that is possessed, but rather something that is exercised. Thus, while situations of relative disempowerment can be theorized, one is never completely out of power. So what's interesting then is to think about the relationship between sexualization of rape and heterosexism. So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code, meaning that transgender people and non-binary people are protected under Canadian law. Canada also has comprehensive laws protecting lesbian and transgender and gay marriage. And so this kind of sexualization or normalization of gender power relations, even the kind of normalization of ways of speaking about or to each other because of gender, are obviously really questionable in this time period because of transgender and queer rights. So finally, there are a lot of controversies regarding freedom of information. In cases of child sexual abuse or sexual assault, does banning information regarding those who are accused of pedophilia or sexual assault of children protect victims, or does it protect those who are accused of these crimes? And this is an ongoing debate regarding publication bans. Who is really being protected in publication bans? Those who are accused of sexual assault or child sexual abuse, or those who are victims? The case of Karla Homolka is one of the most disturbing cases in Canadian history, and Nerbice Phillips has written of the ways that white ethnic people and white women and men are often exonerated of crimes and even extreme crimes. And perhaps this is because of the history of settler colonialism and the ways that whiteness becomes Canadianness, and white people are exalted subjects, as Sunera Tabani has argued, who are often exalted to the point that they can commit all crimes, including crimes of sexual violence. Paul Bernardo was a white middle-class male living a white middle-class life, complete with smuggling cigarettes across the border. And yet this kind of white middle-class status, I think, allowed for jury members to identify with Homolka and Bernardo. Rape is often one of the most underreported crimes in Canada and globally. And many authors have suggested that in order to see rape as a form of grievous bodily injury, rape must be desexualized. In order to refuse to consider rape as a crime of grievous bodily injury and as a hate crime, rapes are written off as unfounded and difficult to prove by the police. The statistics, therefore, do not correspond to the lived experiences of women, non-binary, and transgender people who often report high levels of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. So undercounting rape is actually common by police, and it is one of the reasons that defunding the police has become a major campaign in this time period. As I've mentioned in the case of Cindy Gladue, after Cindy Gladue was murdered by Bradley Barton and found in a hotel bathtub after she bled to death, Bradley Barton was never referred to as a white man. Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native prostitute over 50 times in Canadian courts. But no, Bradley Barton was not a white man. He was just, yes, nice, a nice Canadian. So I'll finish with this quote by Bell Hooks: "Feminism is for everybody." So that is the lecture. I hope you are doing well. And thank you very much for listening. And I hope that you take something away from this discussion regarding rape, colonialism, and violence. Thank you. Goodbye.